Come now, Caleb. Or should I say, Dr. Caleb Harrison.
Oh, yes.
I know exactly who you are.
Did you really think you could hide forever?
History books romanticize the Wild West, but they leave out the desperate bargains made in the snow-choked peaks of Montana. This is the true account of a fugitive, a mountain man, and a fake marriage that shattered every rule of survival. Settle in, because the truth burns. The wind howling through the Bitterroot Mountains in the winter of 1882 didn't just bite. It tore at the flesh. Josephine Cartwright was acutely aware that she had perhaps an hour left to live. The snow was knee-deep. Her leather boots were soaked through, and the heavy wool coat she had stolen from a clothesline in Missoula was doing little to keep the frost from seeping into her bones. She wasn't a pioneer woman exploring the frontier. She was prey. Less than a day behind her rode Elias Caldwell, a ruthless railroad tycoon who had framed her father for embezzlement, stolen their family estate in Chicago, and put a quiet, deadly bounty on Josephine's head to tie up the final loose end. If the mountain didn't kill her, Caldwell's hired Pinkerton hounds would. Just as her vision began to blur at the edges, a square of golden light flickered through the dense curtain of falling snow. A cabin. Josephine dragged her numb legs toward the beacon, collapsing against the heavy, iron-reinforced oak door. She pounded her fists against the wood until her knuckles bled, her voice a fragile croak lost in the gale. The door swung inward with a heavy groan. Heat washed over her, smelling of pine smoke, dried herbs, and roasted meat. Towering in the doorway was a man who looked as though he had been carved directly from the mountain granite. Caleb Montgomery was a giant of a man, clad in worn buckskin and a heavy wolf pelt coat. His dark beard was thick, his eyes the color of a stormy gray sky, and in his right hand he held a Winchester rifle leveled directly at her chest. "We ain't taking visitors." Caleb's voice was a low rumble, rough like gravel. "Please," Josephine gasped, dropping to her knees on the threshold. "They're coming. I just need a corner to die in where it's warm." Caleb stared down at her, his jaw ticking. He was a man who had retreated to the highest, most unforgiving peaks of the Montana Territory, specifically to leave the complications of humanity behind. But looking at the trembling, frostbitten woman bleeding onto his floorboards, his conscience, a thing he thought he had buried years ago, flared. He grabbed her by the collar of her stolen coat and hauled her inside, slamming the heavy door shut against the blizzard. For the next 2 hours, Caleb worked in silence, stoking the fire and forcing hot willow bark broth past her shivering lips. Josephine drifted in and out of consciousness. When she finally opened her eyes with a clear head, she found Caleb sitting across the hearth, sharpening a hunting knife. Before she could offer her gratitude, the unmistakable sound of horses whinnying broke through the storm outside. Heavy boots crunched on the icy porch. "Open up in there," a harsh voice barked. "Pinkerton Detective Agency. We're tracking a female fugitive." Josephine's heart stopped. She looked at Caleb, sheer terror welling in her eyes. This was it. She had brought death to his doorstep. Caleb didn't panic. He slowly stood, his massive frame casting a long shadow across the log walls. He looked at Josephine, then at the door, calculating the odds. 3 men outside, heavily armed. He could kill them, but that would bring the entire agency down on his mountain. He needed a lie, a solid, unbreakable lie. Caleb strode over to where Josephine sat, huddled under a bearskin rug. He knelt, his face inches from hers. "Pretend to be my wife," he whispered, his breath hot against her freezing cheek. Before she could process the words, Caleb stood, walked to the door, and unbarred it. 2 men carrying lanterns and drawn revolvers pushed their way into the entryway, bringing a flurry of snow with them. The lead detective, a scar-faced man named Higgins, sneered. "We're looking for a woman, Josephine Cartwright." "Thief and murderess," Higgins demanded, peering past Caleb's broad shoulders. His eyes landed on Josephine, huddled by the fire. Well, looks like the storm did our work for us." He took a step forward, but Caleb moved with terrifying speed, stepping squarely into Higgins' path. The mountain man didn't raise his rifle. He didn't have to. The sheer, predatory stillness of his posture made the detective freeze. "You're making a mistake, stranger," Caleb said, his voice deceptively calm. "That woman is my wife." Martha Montgomery. Higgins scoffed. "Do I look like a fool to you, mountain man? That's Cartwright. I sent for a mail-order bride from St. Louis 6 months ago." Caleb lied smoothly, not breaking eye contact with the detective. "She arrived in Missoula yesterday. I brought her up the trail myself this morning before the storm hit. If you're calling my wife a whore and a thief in my own home, you'd better be ready to bleed for the insult." The tension in the cabin was thick enough to choke on. Higgins looked at Caleb's calloused hands, resting dangerously close to the Bowie knife at his belt, and then at his partner. The Pinkertons were paid well, but they weren't paid enough to die in a remote cabin over a case of mistaken identity. "You got proof?" Higgins demanded, though his voice lacked its previous venom. "I got a marriage certificate in my lockbox and a shotgun by the door." "Which one you want to see first?" Caleb challenged. Higgins hesitated, then spat on the floorboards. "If we find out you're lying, we'll be back to burn this shack to the ground with both of you inside." "Close the door on your way out," Caleb replied coldly. "You're letting the heat out." When the sound of the horses faded into the howling wind, Josephine let out a ragged breath, her entire body shaking. Caleb locked the door, turned, and walked back to the hearth. He didn't look at her with warmth or relief. He looked at her like a problem he now had to solve. "Listen to me, city girl," Caleb said, establishing the ground rules that would govern their survival. The agreement. "To the town of Pine Bluff down the mountain, and to anyone who rides up here, you are Martha, my wife. You wear the ring I give you. You don't contradict me. The work. You earn your keep. I hunt. You clean. I chop wood. You cook. There are no free rides in the Bitterroots. The golden rule. This is survival. Nothing more. We share a roof, but we do not share a bed. You stay on your side of the cabin. I stay on mine. No attachments, no feelings, no exceptions." Josephine nodded slowly, swallowing her pride. "Understood. No attachments." "Good," Caleb grunted, turning his back to her. "Because the last thing I need out here is to care about someone who's already got a noose around her neck." Winter in the Bitterroot Mountains did not measure time in days or weeks, but in the slow, agonizing depletion of firewood and salted meat. For 3 months, Josephine and Caleb lived in the suffocating intimacy of the one-room cabin, bound together by the lethal cold outside and the dangerous lie they maintained. The transition was brutal for Josephine. Her hands, once soft and manicured for playing the piano in Chicago parlors, blistered and calloused from skinning rabbits, rendering tallow, and scrubbing iron pots with river sand. But underneath the aristocratic upbringing, a fierce, resilient core emerged. She didn't complain. When the chimney draft failed and filled the cabin with smoke, she fixed it. When Caleb returned late from checking his trap lines, bleeding from a superficial cougar scratch, she stitched his arm without flinching. Caleb watched her transformation with quiet, simmering intensity. He had expected her to break. He had wanted her to break, so he could justify his golden rule of emotional detachment. He was a man who had fled society for a reason. Years ago, he had been a renowned surgeon back east. He had lost his real wife and unborn child to a cholera outbreak he couldn't cure, despite all his medical brilliance. The grief had driven him to the edge of the world, vowing never to let another human being close enough to hurt him again. But Josie, as he had begun calling her in his head, was making his vow incredibly difficult to keep. The tension in the cabin was a living, breathing entity. It was in the way they accidentally brushed shoulders while reaching for the coffee tin. It was in the way Caleb's eyes lingered on the curve of her neck when she brushed out her dark hair by the firelight. It was the suffocating silence of the night, separated only by a thin woolen blanket strung across the center of the room. The breaking point arrived in late February, heralded by a storm fiercer than the one that had brought them together. The wind shrieked like a wounded animal, shaking the heavy log walls. The temperature plummeted so fast that the water in the wash basin froze solid within an hour. Caleb had been forced to bring the remaining firewood inside, stacking it near the hearth. The cabin was plunged into a desperate, bone-chilling cold. Around midnight, Caleb woke to the sound of violent shivering. He threw off his furs and pulled back the divider curtain. Josephine was curled into a tight ball on her cot, her lips a frightening shade of blue, her breathing shallow and ragged. The fire had died down to mere embers, unable to fight the sheer volume of frost seeping through the chinking in the logs. Caleb's medical instincts overrode his carefully constructed emotional walls. He knew the signs of severe hypothermia. If he didn't act immediately, she wouldn't survive till morning. "Josie," he barked, dragging her cot closer to the hearth. He tossed a massive pile of dry logs onto the embers, willing the flames to roar back to life. He rubbed her hands, trying to stimulate blood flow, but she was entirely unresponsive, trapped in a dangerous, lethargic daze. "Damn it," Caleb swore softly. There was only one way to transfer enough body heat to save her. He stripped off his heavy coat and boots, wrapped her tightly in 2 thick bearskin rugs, and climbed onto the narrow cot beside her. He pulled her freezing, trembling body flush against his chest, wrapping his muscular arms securely around her. For hours, the only sounds in the cabin were the roaring of the wind outside, the crackling of the resurrected fire, and Caleb's deep, steady breathing as he willed his own warmth into her fragile frame. He held her with a desperate intensity, a terrifying realization washing over him. He was terrified of losing her. The mountain man who had sworn off the world was holding the center of his universe in his arms. Toward dawn, a storm finally broke, leaving behind a profound, eerie silence. The cabin was warm again, smelling of cedar and sweat. Josephine stirred. The blue had left her lips, replaced by a flush of pink. She blinked her eyes open, feeling the heavy, rhythmic thud of a heartbeat against her back. She was entirely enveloped in Caleb's arms, her head resting in the crook of his neck. She should have pulled away. The rule had been clear: no attachments. Instead, she shifted, turning to face him. Caleb's eyes were open, watching her with an intensity that stole the breath from her lungs. The physical proximity was overwhelming. She could see the gold flecks in his gray eyes, feel the rough stubble of his beard, and feel the raw, tightly coiled tension in his muscles. "You're warm," he murmured, his voice thick with sleep and something far more dangerous. "You saved my life," Josephine whispered back, her gaze dropping to his lips. Again, "It was just survival," Caleb replied, though the words sounded hollow, a desperate attempt to maintain a wall that was already crumbling. "Is it?" she challenged softly. She reached up, her small, calloused hand cupping his jaw, her thumb brushing against his lower lip. Caleb closed his eyes at her touch, a shudder ripping through his massive frame. He had fought off wolves, grizzly bears, and armed men without flinching, but this woman's gentle touch completely dismantled him. "Josie, don't," he groaned, opening his eyes to give her one last warning. "If we cross this line, I can't protect you from myself. I don't want protection from you," she breathed. Caleb broke. The self-restraint he had practiced for years snapped like dry timber. He closed the agonizing distance between them, capturing her lips with a hunger that bordered on starvation. The kiss wasn't gentle. It was rough, desperate, and possessive, a fiery collision of 2 lonely souls who had spent months denying the inevitable. Josephine tangled her fingers in his thick hair, pulling him closer, matching his desperate urgency with her own. The single rule that kept them safe was shattered in a heartbeat, burned to ash in the heat of a single kiss. But as Caleb pulled back, gasping for air, resting his forehead against hers, a heavy, metallic sound echoed from outside. It was the unmistakable sound of a rifle being cocked. Through the frost-covered window pane, a voice rang out, clear and cutting through the pristine morning silence. "Morning, newlyweds," Elias Caldwell's voice echoed off the pines. "Higgins told me he found a beautiful runaway bride up here. Now, Caleb Montgomery, you're going to walk out here with your hands up, or I'm going to burn this romantic little cabin straight to hell." The heavy, metallic clack of Elias Caldwell's rifle action shattered the fragile intimacy of the cabin like a stone through stained glass. Caleb Montgomery didn't flinch. but his eyes transformed instantly from soft gray to the color of cold iron. The tender lover vanished. The apex predator of the Bitterroots returned. Without a word, Caleb shoved Josephine hard to the floorboards, throwing his massive frame over hers just as a volley of lead tore through the front door. Splinters of heavy oak rained down on them, accompanied by the deafening roar of gunfire echoing off the canyon walls. "Caleb!" Josephine screamed, her voice muffled by his heavy buckskin coat. "Stay down, Josie," he ordered, his voice a low, gravelly bark. He rolled off her, moving with terrifying agility for a man his size. He grabbed his Winchester from the wall rack and slung a bandolier of ammunition over his shoulder. Outside, Elias Caldwell's laughter cut through the frigid morning air. "Come now, Caleb. Or should I say Dr. Caleb Harrison? Oh yes, I know exactly who you are. Did you really think you could hide forever?" Josephine froze on the floor, looking up at Caleb. "Dr. Harrison?" Caleb's jaw clenched so tight a muscle ticked violently in his cheek. He checked the chamber of his rifle, refusing to meet her eyes. "That's right, Miss Cartwright," Caldwell yelled, his voice projecting over the howling wind. "Your brave mountain man is a wanted fugitive, too. 3 years ago, he hijacked a Union Pacific train headed for Portland, stole $5,000 worth of medical supplies and quinine to treat a worthless mining camp full of immigrants. Marshal Thomas Iron Davies down in Helena has had a standing warrant for him ever since." Josephine stared at Caleb, the pieces snapping into place. He hadn't just lost his wife to cholera. He had sacrificed his entire life, his career, and his freedom to try and save others from the same fate, crossing a ruthless tycoon like Caldwell in the process. He wasn't a monster hiding from the world. He was a man broken by his own righteous rebellion. "Is it true?" she whispered, the smell of gunpowder already thick in the room. "It doesn't matter now," Caleb said flatly, kneeling by the window and resting the barrel of his Winchester on the sill. "They aren't here to arrest us, Josie. Caldwell doesn't leave loose ends. He's here to bury us both under the snow." "Throw out your weapons, Harrison," Caldwell demanded. "Give up the girl, and I'll see to it you hang quick in a proper town instead of freezing to death up here." Caleb answered by firing a single, deafening shot. A cry of pain echoed from the tree line as one of Caldwell's hired guns took a bullet to the shoulder. "Burn them out!" Caldwell roared in fury. "Torch the damn place!" Panic seized Josephine as she heard the unmistakable sound of glass shattering against the exterior logs, followed immediately by the strong, acrid stench of kerosene. Within seconds, a dull whoosh ignited the front porch. The dry timber, seasoned by years of high-altitude sun, caught instantly. Smoke began to curl beneath the doorframe, thick and black. "Caleb, we have to surrender," Josephine pleaded, coughing as the smoke filled the room. "I won't let you burn for me. I'm the one he wants." Caleb grabbed her by the shoulders, pulling her flush against his chest. His eyes burned with a fierce, uncompromising fire that rivaled the flames consuming the cabin. "Listen to me," he growled, shaking her slightly to command her focus. "You broke my rule, Josie. You made me care. And I swear to God, I am not losing another woman I love to a sickness I can't cure, or a rich man's greed. We are walking off this mountain together, or we aren't walking off at all." The declaration struck her heart like a physical blow. A woman I love. He didn't give her time to process it. Caleb dragged her to the center of the room, kicking aside the bearskin rugs that had kept her warm hours prior. He wedged his hunting knife into a crack in the floorboards and hauled upward, revealing a heavy wooden trapdoor. "Root cellar," Caleb coughed, the smoke now lowering to waist height. "I dug a drainage tunnel that empties out into the dry creek bed 50 yards behind the cabin. Move." Josephine dropped into the dark, freezing earth, smelling of root vegetables and damp soil. Caleb followed, pulling the heavy trapdoor shut just as the roof of the cabin began to cave in, showering the room in a cascade of burning embers. They crawled through the pitch-black, narrow tunnel on their hands and knees, the earth pressing in on them. Above, they could hear the roaring inferno of the cabin and the frustrated shouts of the Pinkertons. When they finally burst out into the blinding white of the snow-covered creek bed, The cold hit them like a physical wall. Up the ridge, Caleb pointed toward the jagged, treeless peak of Devil's Tooth Pass. The storm dumped 3 feet of fresh powder. They'll have a hell of a time tracking us if we get high enough. For 2 agonizing hours, they climbed. The snow was relentless, pulling at Josephine's skirts and soaking through her stolen coat. Her lungs burned with the thin, high-altitude air, but every time she stumbled, Caleb was there. His massive hand would grip her arm, hauling her upward, his strength seemingly endless. But they were not alone. Looking down the steep switchbacks, Josephine could see 3 dark figures cutting through the snow. Caldwell had money, but Higgins and his remaining Pinkerton tracker had relentless skill. They were closing the distance. "They're too fast," Josephine gasped, collapsing against a frozen pine near the summit of the ridge. "Caleb, I can't. My legs." "You can," Caleb said, his voice hard, unyielding. He handed her his heavy Colt Peacemaker revolver. "Take this. I've never fired a gun in my life. Point it at the center of their chest and pull the trigger," he instructed coldly. "If I fall, you don't stop running until you hit the mining camp at Virginia City. You find Judge Horace Pendleton. He's a righteous man. Tell him about Caldwell. Tell him everything." Before she could argue, a bullet whined off the granite boulder inches from Caleb's head, showering them in rock fragments. "There they are!" Higgins' voice carried up the canyon. Caleb shoved Josephine behind the boulder and leveled his Winchester. He fired twice, the rapid lever action a blur of motion. The Pinkerton tracker screamed and tumbled backward down the steep incline, lost in the deep snow. "That leaves 2, Caleb muttered, his shoulder bleeding freely where a shard of granite had sliced his coat. But Elias Caldwell was no coward. He stepped out from behind a grove of aspens, wielding a massive Sharps buffalo rifle. It was an unwieldy weapon, but its caliber was devastating. "It's over, Harrison." Caldwell aimed the cannon of a rifle directly at the boulder sheltering them. "You're trapped against the summit." Caleb looked at Josephine. For the first time, the hardened mountain man looked vulnerable. He reached out, his thumb brushing a streak of soot from her cheek. "I'm sorry I couldn't give you a better life, Josie." "You gave me my life back," she answered, gripping the Colt. Caleb stood up, exposing himself over the boulder to draw Caldwell's fire away from her. He aimed his Winchester, but Caldwell was faster. The thunderous roar of the Sharps rifle was deafening. Caleb jerked backward as the heavy-caliber bullet tore through his left shoulder, spinning him around and dropping him into the blood-stained snow. "Caleb!" Josephine screamed, pure adrenaline overriding her terror. She stood up, gripping the heavy Colt with both hands. Higgins was advancing, aiming his pistol at her. Josephine closed her eyes and pulled the trigger. The gun bucked violently in her hands. She opened her eyes to see Higgins staring down at his chest in shock before collapsing forward. Caldwell cursed, struggling to reload the single-shot Sharps. He looked up at Josephine, a cruel sneer crossing his face. "Just you and me now, little bird." But nature, it seemed, had a different verdict. The echoing roar of Caldwell's buffalo rifle had been a fatal mistake. The concussive wave of the massive gunshot reverberated off the sheer granite cliffs of Devil's Tooth Pass. High above them, thousands of tons of freshly fallen, unstable snow shifted. A sound like a freight train ripping through the earth filled the air. Josephine looked up. The entire top of the mountain was falling. "Josie!" Caleb roared, fighting through the shock of his gunshot wound. He lunged forward, grabbing her by the waist and dragging her backward into a deep, narrow crevasse carved into the cliff face behind them. Elias Caldwell looked up, his sneer evaporating into pure, unadulterated terror. He dropped his rifle and tried to run, but there was nowhere to go. The white wave hit with the force of an ocean. The avalanche roared past the mouth of the crevasse, plunging the world into a deafening, suffocating darkness. Josephine buried her face in Caleb's chest, holding on to him as the mountain shook violently around them. And then, silence. Hours later, Caleb dug them out of the snowbank using his good arm. The valley below them was utterly changed, wiped clean by the avalanche. Caldwell, Higgins, and the Pinkertons were gone, buried under 50 feet of packed ice and snow. The bounty on Josephine's head and the vendetta against Caleb died with them on the mountain. It took them 4 days to reach Virginia City. Josephine used the knowledge Caleb had taught her in the cabin to keep his wound clean, packing it with snow and pine sap to stave off infection. They walked into Judge Horace Pendleton's office, bruised, battered, and smelling of smoke and blood. True to Caleb's word, Pendleton investigated Caldwell's sudden disappearance. Without the tycoon's iron fist, his corrupt empire crumbled, and the embezzled funds from the Cartwright estate were eventually recovered. Marshal Thomas Davies, hearing the true story of the stolen medicine, quietly lost Caleb's arrest warrant in a clerical fire. 2 months later, in a small church in Virginia City, Caleb Montgomery stood at an altar. He wore a clean suit, his arm in a sling, his gray eyes fixed warmly on the woman walking down the aisle. When the preacher asked if Caleb took Josephine to be his wife, he didn't whisper it. He said it loud enough for the entire town to hear. The fake marriage that began as a desperate lie in a blizzard became the truest thing the Wild West had ever seen. The mountain man had broken his only rule, and in doing so, he saved them both. The Wild West was built on the backs of survivors who refused to let the harsh frontier dictate their fate. If Caleb and Josephine's relentless fight for love and survival kept you on the edge of your seat, hit that like button and share this video. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more untold historical romances and frontier dramas.